What if the worst economic disaster in modern history didn't just destroy a currency, but created the conditions for the deadliest war in human history? November 1923, Weimar, Germany. A loaf of bread costs 200 billion marks. Workers carry wages in wheelbarrows. Children build blocks with stacks of worthless banknotes. The German middle class, teachers, doctors, engineers, the educated backbone of society, watches their life savings evaporate in months. And in a Munich beer hall, a failed artist named Adolf Hitler attempts a coup, tries to seize power by force, gets arrested, and serves 9 months in prison where he writes Mein Kampf. 10 years later, he's Chancellor of Germany. 16 years later, he starts World War II. 50 million people die. Here's what they don't teach you in history class. These events are connected, not coincidentally but causally. The hyperinflation of 1923 didn't just destroy money. It destroyed the social fabric, the middle class, the belief in democratic institutions, and created a traumatized population desperate for someone who promised to restore order and dignity regardless of the cost. This is the story of how printing money to pay debts led directly to fascism and world war, why economic collapse always creates conditions for extremism, and why we're following the exact same pattern right now in 2025. The lesson is clear. Hyperinflation doesn't just destroy currency, it destroys civilization itself. Let's start with the economic collapse, because understanding the severity reveals why it created Hitler. World War I ended in 1918 with Germany's defeat. The Treaty of Versailles imposed 132 billion gold marks in reparations, roughly equivalent to $500 billion today, or about 100% of Germany's pre-war GDP. This debt was intentionally designed to be unpayable as punishment for the war. Germany faced a choice: default and face military occupation, or find a way to pay. They chose to pay, but they couldn't raise enough through taxation because the economy was destroyed by 4 years of war, unemployment was high, industrial production had collapsed, and tax revenue was insufficient. So they did what governments always do when they can't raise money through taxes or borrowing: they printed it. The Reichsbank began printing marks to pay reparations, to fund government operations, to keep the economy from completely collapsing. Initially, this seemed to work. More money in circulation meant more spending, which created the appearance of economic activity. Unemployment stayed relatively low because the government could print money to fund projects and employ people. But this wasn't wealth creation, it was currency debasement that would soon accelerate into total collapse. The numbers show how fast currency destruction accelerates once it starts. In 1918, the mark traded at roughly 8 marks per US dollar. By January 1920, it was 65 marks per dollar, significant devaluation but still manageable. By January 1922, it was 191 marks per dollar. People started getting nervous, but economists assured them this was temporary. Then the acceleration began. By January 1923, it hit 17,972 marks per dollar, a 94-fold devaluation in just 1 year. Then it went exponential. July 1923, 353,412 marks per dollar. August 1923, 4.6 million marks per dollar. October 1923, 25 billion marks per dollar. November 1923, 4.2 trillion marks per dollar. The currency lost 99.9999% of its value in less than 2 years. A savings account with 1 million marks in 1921, enough to buy a nice house, could buy a loaf of bread in 1923. This wasn't gradual economic decline. This was exponential destruction of everything denominated in marks, which was everything: savings, pensions, insurance policies, bonds, salaries, life's accumulated wealth gone in months. Here's who got destroyed and why it mattered for what came next. The middle class was annihilated. Salaried workers watched their wages become worthless, paid twice a day because morning wages were worthless by evening. Pensioners starved, fixed pensions couldn't buy food as prices rose hourly. Savers saw bank accounts evaporate, money saved over decades became worth nothing. Teachers, doctors, engineers, lawyers, civil servants, the educated professional class that formed the backbone of civilized society, all ruined. A university professor in 1922 earned less than a manual laborer by 1923 because wages couldn't keep up with exponential inflation. Meanwhile, some groups profited enormously: Industrialists with physical assets saw factories hold value while currency collapsed. Currency speculators made fortunes betting against the mark. Foreign buyers with dollars or pounds bought German assets, real estate, businesses, art collections, for pennies on the dollar. Black market operators thrived, but the middle class, the people who played by the rules, saved money, got educated, worked professional jobs, believed in the system, were destroyed. And when you destroy the middle class, you destroy the foundation of democratic stability. This is where Hitler enters the story, and the timing is not coincidental. November 8, 1923, at the peak of hyperinflation when bread cost 200 billion marks, Hitler and his Nazi party attempted the beer hall putsch in Munich, a failed coup attempt to seize power by force. They marched on the Bavarian government, got into a gunfight with police, 16 Nazis and 4 police died. Hitler fled and was arrested 2 days later. He was tried for treason, sentenced to 5 years, served 9 months in Landsberg prison where he wrote Mein Kampf. The coup failed because Germany wasn't desperate enough yet. But Hitler recognized something. The hyperinflation had traumatized an entire generation, destroyed their faith in democracy and capitalism, and created psychological wounds that wouldn't heal. He just needed to wait for the next crisis to exploit that trauma. The hyperinflation ended in November 1923 when Germany introduced the Rentenmark, a new currency backed by real estate and industrial assets, strictly limited in supply. The new currency stabilized, prices stopped rising, and Germany entered a period of relative recovery from 1924–1929. But the social damage was permanent. Here's what the hyperinflation did psychologically that created conditions for Hitler. It destroyed trust in institutions completely. The government that told people their savings were safe presided over total currency collapse. The banks that held deposits went bankrupt. The economists who said inflation was temporary were proven catastrophically wrong. The entire establishment, political, economic, academic, failed spectacularly. This created a traumatized population that stopped believing in expertise, in institutions, in the democratic system that had presided over their ruin. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, Germany was still psychologically scarred from 1923. Unemployment rose from 9% in 1929 to 30% by 1932. People faced economic crisis again, and this time they weren't willing to trust the democratic system that had already failed them once. They wanted someone strong who promised to restore order, dignity, and national pride regardless of democratic niceties. Hitler offered exactly that. The numbers show the rise. In the 1928 election, the Nazi Party got 2.6% of votes, a fringe party. In September 1930, after the Depression hit, they got 18.3%, second largest party. In July 1932, they got 37.3%, largest party. In January 1933, Hitler became chancellor. By March 1933, he had dictatorial powers. By 1934, he was Führer with total control. The democratic Weimar Republic that had presided over hyperinflation, and then depression collapsed completely and was replaced by fascism. And once in power, Hitler pursued the policies that led to World War II. Massive rearmament, territorial expansion, invasion of Poland in 1939, and ultimately 50 million deaths in the deadliest conflict in human history. The line from hyperinflation in 1923 to Hitler's beer hall putsch in 1923 to his rise to power in 1933 to World War II in 1939 is direct and causal, not coincidental. This is the empire pattern that repeats throughout history. Economic collapse creates conditions for extremism. Extremism leads to authoritarianism. Authoritarianism leads to war. Rome's currency collapse in the 3rd century led to 50 years of military emperors and civil wars. The French Revolution's hyperinflation with assignats led to Napoleon and 20 years of European wars. The Soviet Union's economic collapse led to Stalin's purges, Second World War participation. Weimar's hyperinflation led to Hitler, Second World War. The pattern is consistent. When economic systems fail catastrophically, populations become desperate, democracy becomes blamed for the crisis, and strongmen who promise order and national restoration gain power regardless of the cost to freedom or human life. And here's what should terrify you about 2025. We're following the exact same pattern. The US has printed $8 trillion since 2008, has $36 trillion in unpayable debt, growing $1 trillion every 100 days. Faces inflation that's officially 3–4% but realistically higher, and has political polarization at levels not seen since the Civil War. We have all the conditions that created Weimar: unpayable debts, money printing to cover them, middle-class squeeze, loss of faith in institutions, and rising political extremism on both sides. The only question is whether we stop before reaching Weimar's endpoint: hyperinflation, social collapse, and the rise of authoritarianism that leads to war. History says we won't stop because the incentives push toward more printing, more debt, more institutional failure until the system breaks completely. This is the empire economy, where we decode the patterns that show economic collapse doesn't just destroy wealth, it destroys civilization and creates the conditions for humanity's worst impulses to take power. Weimar proved that printing money leads to Hitler. We're running the same experiment and expecting different results.